All right. Welcome to No Way Out. Dr. Klein, how are you today, sir?
I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me for this conversation. I appreciate it, Ponch.
No, thank you. And in fact, I want to start off with a big thank you. I think I want to spend a minute here first to kind of paint a picture of who you are relative to saving lives in the military, if you don't mind. So I'm going to start there. All right. Back in 2019, you and I met in Whistler, Canada, through Dave Snowden. I got to spend a few days with you and Dave and a few other brilliant folks. You and I sat down. We talked about recognition prime decision making, some overlap with the OODA loop as far as counterfactuals, mental simulations, things like that. We had a fantastic conversation. We also had dinner a few times. We talked about what it's like to lead in a complex environment. And more importantly, how do you develop leadership skills or leaders to do that, to work in uncertainty? Um, During the conversation, you pointed out a few things that I did not know, and I want to make sure the world kind of knows this. Number one, you mentioned. I think the context was I was talking about a recent program I was working on with the U.S. Navy following the 2017 mishaps at sea, and during that time, I got to engage with quite a few folks, and one of them was Dr. David Woods. And do you remember? You have a connection with Dr. Woods, correct?
Yes, I've known him for a few decades.
Yeah, a few decades. So, for those listeners out there who aren't familiar with Dr. David Woods, the DevOps community, development operations, is built heavily on his resilience engineering thinking and strong connection to complexity theory, human factors, and safety. So, that was fantastic to learn from you that you had a connection there. And then you start asking me not a strange question, but a question I just couldn't wrap my head around. And it was, Ponch, do you know John Schmidt? I thought for a minute, I'm like, well, I know of a John Schmidt, but I don't know John Schmidt. And you kept talking and we kept talking. And I paused and I said, wait a minute, are you talking about John Schmidt, the author of MCDP1, Warfighting? And you said, yeah, of course. That's John. And would you mind sharing with our listeners how you know John Schmidt?
All right, so gosh, it would have been in about 20 years ago. Uh, John was in the Marines, and he read an article that I wrote for Military Review about decision making, about my recognition prime decision model. And John really resonated to it. He said, "This is a model that captures what I think is actually happening." So John got excited, and he called me and put me in touch with uh, General Van Riper, who was then a two-star, eventually became a three-star. And then John went further. He led an invasion of our next naturalistic decision making conference. We were invaded by the Marines. This was in Dayton, Ohio, and there was a contingent of 7 Marines that we hadn't really been expecting, and it was wonderful. And they really changed the whole nature of the conference. John ran a tactical decision game. General Van Riper spoke to the group about decision making. And so John and I have been friends and colleagues ever since. And John is now a member of my ShadowBox company. He's about half time, 3/4 time, working with us on a variety of projects involving military, law enforcement, firefighting, things like that.
It's just an amazing connection. And of course, you're connected to more folks like Dave Snowden. I know you've done work with him on anthro simulation, anthro complexity. But at the heart of everything, and I want to go back to this a little bit deeper. One of the reasons I'll argue that a lot of my brothers and sisters are still alive in fighter aviation and surface warfare is because of a lot of work you did following an awful tragedy near Iran. Right, we had a USS Vincennes, I believe it was, mistakenly shot down an Airbus, and the Navy asked you to come in to take a look at what is known or what was known as tactical decision making under stress. Can you walk us through a little bit behind that?
Right. So um, we had the very first conference on naturalistic decision making in Dayton, Ohio in 1989. And there was a contingent from the Navy because this had happened right after the Vincennes shootdown, which I think was in 1988. And this should never have happened. The Vincennes was an Aegis class cruiser, tremendously advanced. How could it confuse an Airbus, a commercial airliner, with an Iranian fighter plane? Yet it did, and it shot it down. And the Navy was trying to understand how that happened and what they could do about it. And the Navy started a 10-year program of research called TADMIS, Tactical Decision Making Under Stress, to try to understand that. And we became part of that TADMIS team. I had a chance to conduct a few interviews with Captain Will Rogers, who was the captain on the Vincennes, to try to get underneath his decision-making process and see what happened, and then to try to develop some ideas for training decision-making and for designing systems to support decision-making. So that was an unfortunate disaster, a terrible disaster that led to this program of research.
Yeah, thank you for that. The Naval Aviation picked up on this after the program went away, and we included a lot of lessons into what is now known as crew resource management. And I believe you work with Dr. Salas on some of that, Eduardo Salas. But a lot of your research, from what I read, is connected to high risk environments, including aviation, firefighting, first responders, cognitive task analysis, things like that. And of course, our red teaming school that went away a few years ago or a year ago borrows a lot from your work as well. But let's get down to the big thank you. Why does this matter? Your work has helped us learn how to make decisions in complex environments, right? We have programs that help us do that. And unlike a physical object, such as an ejection seat, we can't put our finger on that and say, that's why I'm alive today, right? But the reason many of us are thriving in these complex environments, in these high reliability environments, is because the work that you and others around you that we mentioned have done. So I just want to take a moment to thank you for all that awesome work that many people don't know about. And I want to just say thanks on behalf of my brothers and sisters that are all alive because of you. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you for all of the heroic work that you and your brothers and sisters in the military perform on a regular basis that never gets appropriately appreciated. So thank you back to you, Ponch.
Oh, thanks again. So there's one story I want to talk about before we dive into the cognitive dimension. And I think this story I read after I was an instructor in the F-14. And that is a story about an F-4 pilot who was transitioning to an A-6 and having a challenging time landing on an aircraft carrier. Do you recall that story?
Yes.
Yeah, it's so it reminded me of when we were transitioning pilots from the P3 community or the helicopter community. We really had to discover a way I had to figure out how to do this in a naturalistic setting. And that was, how do we get them to see things from a different perspective so they can make a connection and ultimately come up with an answer, right? Because having an instructor telling them that they're doing something wrong or how to do something right all the time doesn't always work. And I believe that story about the F4 to A6 pilot was the landing signal officer had to sit down with him and just had the pilot use his thumb. I think he put his thumb out in front of him to figure out where the sight picture was and see the sight picture and say, hey, look, that's your old sight picture from the F4. Your new sight picture is a little bit to the right. And he discovered that through that. I don't know if I did that story any justice, but you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, you captured the essence, the gist of it. But I like the story so much, so let me fill it out a little bit.
Sure.
So the pilot was a friend of mine, Doug Harrington Jr., and he was a very good naval pilot and became an instructor pilot. And he was flying F4s, and then he would fly for the training. He would be flying with a student, and but he would be sitting behind the student, and that's the way the configuration of the F4 worked. And he did an outstanding job. And then it was time for him to transition to an A6. and they figured they'll just show him the layout. He understands the controls, and it seemed like a piece of cake. But he had to do 6 carrier landings in order to qualify, and then I think he had to do another 2 at night. So he takes off, and he thinks everything is going to be fine. Circles around now. He's got to do the carrier landing. He's got nose perfectly positioned. Everything is fine, and the landing signal officer waves him off. And he's like, what? I'm perfectly lined up. What's going on here? Is he hazing me? So he goes around again, lines up again. He's got it perfectly positioned, nose on the center line, and landing signal officer tells him, come right, come right. That's what he had told him before. And Harrington knew that he was perfectly lined up, so he was ignoring that because he knows how to fly. And he gets waved off again. So now he's got to go around and try again. And he figures this landing signal officer has more patience than I have fuel. So maybe I need to listen to him. So he comes right just a little bit, and he's told, come right further. And eventually he's able to land, but it's a ragged landing. And in fact, none of his landings that day were particularly good. And he's told, we're not going to let you do any landings tonight because you did so poorly on the landings during the day. We're going to repeat it tomorrow. If you don't do better tomorrow, that's it. That's the end of your flying career in the Navy. Doug is in shock. And his friends come up to him and they offer him really useful advice like, Doug, you really got to bear down tomorrow. Or, Doug, you got to pay attention. Or they were telling him things that were of no value whatsoever and were just driving his anxiety level even higher. So that night he was getting ready to go to sleep, hoping that he'll wake up from this nightmare. And there's a knock on the door, and Doug says, go away. He doesn't want to talk to anybody else. But it's the landing signal officer who's not in charge of training, but really wanted to help Doug. So he eventually persuades Doug to let him in. And he said, let's try to figure out what went wrong today. And Doug said, I had it perfectly lined up. And you kept telling me, come right, and waving me off. And landing signal officer said, okay, so you're landing on an A6. What was the last plane because you were qualified? What were you qualified? And Doug said, an F4. And the landing signal officer thought a little bit and said, now, an F4, you're lined up in a line with the nose of the plane. Everything's in a straight line. Doug said, yeah. An A6, you're side by side with a co-pilot, so you're not lined up with the center line of the plane. Doug said, it's only what is it, 1.5 feet? What kind of a difference is that going to make? And that's when the landing signal officer said, let's try this. Hold out your thumb, close one eye, hold out your thumb, and that's going to be the nose of your plane. Now line it up with that door, okay, you got it lined up, fine. Now, move your head over 1 foot, and how do you have to pull your thumb over to make it line up with the door? And Doug said, oh my gosh, what an idiot I am. And he hadn't thought about the parallax. He hadn't thought about the parallax effect. He hadn't realized what a strong effect it was. And once he had that in mind, that totally changed his mental model. And the next day he had no trouble qualifying. I love the story because the landing signal officer wasn't in charge of training him, was also bright enough, sensitive enough, and alert enough to ask him what was he transitioning from so he could diagnose why Doug was having this problem, and was also creative enough to come up with a simple exercise that Doug could use so that the landing signal officer didn't have to tell him anything. He could let Doug discover it for himself because those discoveries make more of a difference. So that's why I think it's such a powerful example.
Yeah, and I got to live that as an instructor. And when we think about, winning in a complex environment, or um, in combat or conflict, or winning in business, it really comes down to people, ideas, and things in that order. And in fact, it's the mind that will ultimately win, right? And that's what we're talking about, is the cognitive dimension, with you today. Basically, we're not machines, right? We are very different than ants and data processors and things like that. So we have a different way to look. We need a different way to look at how humans make decisions. But you I don't know if you coined the term cognitive dimension, but you use it in your new book, Snapshots of the Mind. Can you tell me a little bit more about this dimension of the mind?
Sure. So a lot of training assumes that complex tasks can be broken down into procedures, and people just have to follow those procedures. And procedures are important. I'm not criticizing procedure, but they're not enough. It doesn't. The procedures don't capture what we've learned, our expertise, what sometimes is called tacit knowledge, which means the kinds of patterns we can recognize, the kinds of perceptual discriminations we make, our mental models. Here with Doug was an example of somebody who had a flawed mental model. And, it's not boiling down to him following procedures. He needed to adapt his previous mental model and replace parts of it with a much more effective one. So the cognitive dimension is largely invisible. It's not a set of steps to follow. It's what you have to know in order to follow those steps effectively, to know when to depart from those steps, when to modify those steps. And it's really at the basis of the expertise that people need to develop.
So you brought up mental model, and there might be a connection here to these mental steps, these cognitive steps that people have to take. Um, I've been it's my understanding that we can take lessons from high performing teams, like how do they work, or high performing leaders or decision makers, and we just kind of borrow their steps. If they're thinking through something, and we can adapt it for our own. Is that aligned to the idea of a mental model, borrowing that from someplace else and bringing it over to another domain or another aspect?
That certainly is a part of it. And I can give you an example of that. This is an example from about over a century ago, around 1900. British warships were firing cannons, and the accuracy rate was pretty miserable. And one captain, Percy Scott, I think was his name, he later became an admiral. He was he just was he didn't tolerate mediocre performance. So he was having his crew do target practice and just shaking his head at how inaccurate they were. But he noticed one of the gun crews was doing much better than the others. So he went over and he watched them for a while to try to see what they were doing that was different. And he noticed that the chief gunner, see, what you have to do is you have to figure out how much charge to have. That depends on how far away the target is. But the ship is rolling. And if you fire when it's too far down, it's going to hit the water, or too far up, it's going to go over. And so they would fix the elevation, but then as the ship rolled, you try to wait until the cannon was exactly at that right point. Then you would try to get the shot off, and that was just an instant. And if something went wrong, you would miss it. And this one crew that was doing such a good job, he noticed that the chief gunner unconsciously was moving the elevation. He didn't leave it fixed. And so as the ship was rolling, he would start to raise the elevation. And as the ship was rolling back, he would lower it. And that gave him a bigger window to pull the trigger rather than this instantaneous demand that they had. And Scott said, I could teach that to the other gun crews. And they call it now they call it continuous aim firing. And he taught it to the other gun crews. the accuracy increased tremendously. So that's an example of transferring a mental model to other teams. And this was an unconscious mental model because that gunner didn't know what he was doing. He just had learned that this would, he just had learned it without even thinking about it. That's an example of tacit knowledge.
And sometimes experts don't know how to describe why they're experts, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But that happens more and more because what makes experts so good is that they've internalized all of these lessons
yeah.
and they think everybody sees it. They don't even, they're not even aware of what they do. And it's tacit knowledge, which means that it's very difficult for them to articulate to others what they're doing.
Yeah.
But just say, watch me and you'll figure it out.
I think this is a very important point to emphasize for transitioning veterans who have gone through human factors training, have learned lessons from TADMIS, operational risk management, threat and error management, a lot of the work that IO psychologists have done for the military. But because it's built into our culture, we just don't think anything of it. When we go to an organization, we don't take the way we used to plan and identify the threats early. We don't map out things in an organization. And I'm talking about veterans that transition over. But what's interesting is a lot of organizations now are trying to learn how do we make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. And, again, a lot of lessons from IO psychology are being transferred into that space to underneath team science and distributed leadership and teaching complexity theory. But when we talk about like a basketball team or a firefighting squad, I think that's what they're called. Can we take lessons from those domains and apply them to like software development and decision making? Is that possible?
I think it is. This is one of the things that Eduardo Salas has done with his team steps approach,
Yeah.
where he's watched different kinds of teams, extracted important lessons that generalize from one domain to another. So I think there are general strategies that teams can use. But let me give you another example. John Schmidt had been presenting tactical decision games
Mm-hmm.
during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, to a small group of young officers. And one of the things he noticed was they had been taught the school solution and how to make decisions, and they had all kinds of ways of calculating things. But in the tactical decision games, John wouldn't give them all the information that they wanted to have. And they would say, but how do I make a decision if I don't have all of these data? And John said, in a real world situation, you're not going to have all these data. You're going to have to make a decision when there's a fair amount of uncertainty. And it took them a while to adapt to that idea that it wasn't just about calculating, it was about speculative thinking and imagining it and being resilient and being able to improvise. But eventually they got there. So he was able to get them to that point, and that was a change in their mindset, where instead of thinking my decision making is about following the steps that I learned in school, to my decision making is going to boil down to my ability to size up situations and make reasonable assumptions and anticipate what might happen.
So on TDGs, these happen to be a great way for adult learning or providing experiential learning activities, correct?
Right.
Okay, so the way I understand we need to train leaders in decision making is we have to give them some type of experience. And going back to the A6F4 story, we have to let them see things for themselves and make decisions and make the connections to their day-to-day work. Is that what TDGs kind of do?
Right. With a good facilitator. And
Okay.
John Schmidt is one of is one of the best facilitators that I've seen. I've also seen mediocre facilitators
Hmm.
who know what the steps are and they're trying to follow the steps of a TDG without thinking about who are the people that I'm working with and how can I give them a good mental workout and how can I read their reactions to know where they're confused
Yeah.
and to try to work with them.
So this actually brings up a great point right now, and I don't know if I can share it in a moment. But when we were in Whistler, you shared with me a card, right? And hopefully I can share it right now. I'm going to bring it up here so you and I can view it. And I believe you said it's in your wallet, and it connects back to decision making games. But here's a card. Eh, When you're doing these TDGs, I believe you can use this card, which has it's called the situational awareness calibration questions.
Yeah.
And I'll read the first one. What is the immediate goal of your squad? And when we're doing a TDG, sometimes we can hit pause and have people answer these questions. Is that the intent behind this card?
Yeah, let me tell you how the card got developed. It was developed by um, a colleague, a former colleague of mine, Dave Klinger. We were working. He was working with nuclear power plants, and they were they were a very good nuclear power plant, but they weren't handling emergency drills very well.
Mm-hmm.
And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would come by periodically, put them through an emergency drill, and they weren't doing well. And they needed to improve. They needed to improve rapidly before the next visit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Otherwise, they were going to have all kinds of penalties, additional training. It was going to cost them maybe $1 million a year if they didn't shape up. So they brought Doug Harrington Jr. and with Dave Klinger in our group. And Dave diagnosed that one of the problems was there was a lack of common ground.
Mm-hmm.
So Dave developed this card to help create better common ground from the crisis manager and the team. He would ask these questions and have each of the team members write out their answer during a drill that they had. And then he would collect all their answers. And then at the end of the drill, because he didn't want to interrupt the drill, at the end of the drill, he would show them how many different ways they answered the same question. So he didn't have to say, you guys aren't calibrated. That's sort of, shaking his finger at them. They could see for themselves how poorly calibrated they were. So this was a card aimed at helping them figure out, especially the crisis manager, figure out how to create better common ground.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the strange part of the story, this is just a training aid. About 6 months after Dave put on the training and worked with this nuclear group, they had a small upset. It wasn't as big as 3 Mile Island, but it was a small little upset that they had to react to. And it took them about 12 hours to get it under control. Halfway through the upset, 6 hours into it, the crisis manager turns to his team and says, okay, time out. We're all under the gun here, but I don't want us to make any dangerous mistakes. You all have that card, that laminated card that we got from Dave Klinger and his Klein Associates group. Take out that card. I'm going to tell you, think about how you're going to answer each of these questions on the card that you just showed, Ponch. And we don't have the time to write it out. Just think about how you'd answer them. I'm going to tell you the way I would answer them. And you could see if you agree. And if you think I'm wrong, let me know. But he was essentially doing a calibration, a mid-course correction during an actual crisis. So we never designed it as an operational tool. That's how he used it.
Yeah, to me, it's a fantastic way to understand if we have a shared mental model. I think that I'm using that term correctly of what we're trying to do as a group or organization. And within a TDG or a training environment, it allows us to see it in the safety in that environment, but we can also apply it in our day to day work. And when we do use a card or a card like it or SenseMaker to help people see the differences in their perspectives, it's absolutely shocking to them. And again, it connects back to the A6 story about they have to see it for themselves. We can't tell them they're all seeing things differently. They have to see it. But back to TDGs and training. Right now, there's a lot of digital capabilities out there. We prefer what we call uh, high touch, low tech approaches. Is that similar to what you're using in training?
Right. So the technique that we tend to use most of the time now is a technique called ShadowBox. And ShadowBox is a way of having people see the world through the eyes of experts without the experts being there. It's a scenario-based approach. and you go through a scenario. And the scenario is designed in advance to be challenging. And then at a certain point in the scenario, we'll have a decision point. It might be, here's 4 courses of action. Rank order which one you're most likely to pursue, and then write down your reason. The scenario continues. Another decision point, here are 3 goals. Rank order which one has the highest value to you, and write down your reason. And then they go back to the scenario, it continues. There might be another decision point. Here's 5 types of information. Which are you going to pursue as the most important to you, and rank order them that way, and write down what your reasons are. So you go through, there's usually about 4 to 6 decision points like that. Now, we've also had a small group of experts, maybe 3, 4, usually not more than 5, go through the same scenario. They've done their ranking. They've written down their reasons. So when I do my ranking, I can immediately see, how do the experts rank them? And then I also have what I wrote down as my rationale. I get to see what the rationale of the experts were. I could see what inferences they're making. I could see what concerned them. I can see what reactions they had. We're all looking at the same scenario, but I get to see this scenario through their eyes as well as through my own. And this could be done with paper and pencil. We have software versions of it,
Yeah.
and it's we've done a variety of studies showing that going through these exercises in just a half day, people align with the experts. It increases by about 25%.
Now, that expertise, is it about the subject matter expertise? Are they subject matters in a particular field, or is it about how we make decisions? I'm a little confused on that.
It's the experts in that field.
Okay. Okay.
Right.
All right. So we, like firefighters, I believe you're using it with firefighters. Is it correct?
We've used it with firefighters, yes. And as a matter of fact, that's where it originated with a friend of mine in the Heinz, New York Fire Department. He was the one who developed this approach in the aftermath of the 9/11 disaster.
Yeah. Yeah. So now there are types of problems in the world that we just can't solve for, right? And at the same time, we still have to develop decision-making capabilities in that space. And I think it's called a wicked problem. Is that correct?
Right.
Right. You have some insights on what a wicked problem is, and what we need to do to make better decisions. And by the way, a lot of the problems I believe that we're experiencing globally today they're wicked problems, correct?
Yes, they are. Yes. And these are extremely challenging, extremely vexing. A wicked problem is one where there's no right answer. It's not something you can calculate the solution to, because there's so many variables. They interact in so many different ways. The context keeps changing. There's different stakeholders with different motivations and different goals that have to be negotiated. So you can't find, here's the right answer. So you see how pervasive wicked problems are in social problems that we deal with. So working with John Schmidt and with another colleague of ours, Sean Murphy, we got together and said, what can we say that's useful about handling wicked problems? There's not going to be a recipe. There's not going to be a set of procedures. Here are the steps to follow to solve wicked problems, because there's no solution. There's no solution that everybody would agree with, or even one person would agree with from time one to time two. And we did it using a naturalistic study. We collected over 30 examples of people wrestling with wicked problems to try to see, what did they do, what worked, what didn't work, and what were some of the mistaken ideas people had about wicked problems, and then what can we do to help people handle wicked problems more effectively? We came up with a variety of tools that we're hoping to pilot very soon. So wicked problems are very different from the usual decision-making training that people are given. They involve mental flexibility. They involve an ability to take other people's perspective. They involve an ability to shift our mental model about what's going on. And there's a tool, one of the tools we have is a clarity frame to show people here's your understanding of this wicked problem at the beginning. Here is who you think are the stakeholders. Here are the goals that you've identified. Here are the kind of barriers that you're up against. Here's what you think are the big challenges in the situation, things like that. And then after they work and wrestle with the wicked problem for a while, they do another clarity frame. And then after a while, they do another one, and they get to see, even though they're still wrestling, it's still hard. They look back at their original one and they think, how was I so dense?
Yeah.
Look at how shallow my understanding was then compared to what it is now.
So, on a wicked problem, we need to have multiple perspectives, which requires the flow of information to move freely around a group of people, correct? Is that
Right. Mhm.
okay? At the moment we shut that down, we lose. What do we lose when we don't get the best, or when people can't be themselves and bring their best answer to work? When they just feel, I guess there's fear in the organization. They don't feel comfortable in sharing their perspective. That's a problem when we're trying to solve wicked problems, is it not?
Right. So one of the mistaken mindsets that people have with the wicked problem is I'm going to find a solution and then I'm going to reveal it to everybody and everybody will jump on the bandwagon. That doesn't happen. There's always going to be some people, maybe most of the people, who are frustrated. There's a sense that I don't want to have to make trade offs. I want to find a solution that everybody can resonate to. Well, too bad. When you're dealing with multiple stakeholders, each with their own goals, you're going to have to make trade offs. Another mindset problem that people have is I know how things are working out, and so I need other people to buy into my mindset. That's not going to get you very far. You need to engage in perspective taking to see why are other people resisting. What is it? Not just what that they want, but how are they viewing this situation? That's different from what I was expecting. What can I learn from it? And it's a very difficult for a lot of people, including a lot of leaders, to take other people's perspective.
So this is interesting because when I was in active duty military, going from the tactical, operational, and strategic level of warfare, those lessons that we had at the tactical level are very powerful. But as years passed, and now I'm at the operational or strategic level, I don't have that tactical knowledge anymore. I'm dangerous, right? So as a leader, what we try to coach leaders is you want to have those people that had that tactical knowledge of what's going on, those subject matter experts, be part of the planning process or be part of this decision making process. Um, are we off in that thinking, or can you comment on that? Is that how do you align to that view?
Right. So I think you're spot on, except that you're not emphasizing how difficult that shift is much. You've been able to make that. Many people can't. Many people are anchored at the tactical level because that's where they were so successful. That's why they got promoted. And so they're still trying to adjust the thinking of the people who are working underneath them rather than shifting to a leadership role of managing precious resources and valuable resources and getting the most out of other people. And the baseball quote that I remember, a manager said, "My job as a manager is to get paid for other people's home runs." And that's the shift. That's
Yeah.
hard for a lot of players who become managers and aren't really thinking that they've got to get the most out of their players rather than making it all about themselves and reflecting on themselves.
Can we help train people and leaders with TDGs and ShadowBox? Does that help develop that type of? I'm going to use the word mindset.
I think you can. I think
Okay.
it's possible. there are some people who are never going to make that mindset transition. So I don't want to claim that we can get everybody there, but I think everybody can be moved in a better direction if they get the right kinds of TDG, scenario-based, ShadowBox experiences. It can at least move them in the right direction. And for some people, the light will go on, and they'll be able to make the transition you described to the operational and strategic levels.
I believe so. So we we have a lot of ideas or a lot of things we can talk about. We can go in many directions. A lot of people use your pre-mortem techniques. I just want to hit on that for a moment in a training scenario. So when we're trying to help people or teams develop a mental model of how to think through complex problems, maybe even wicked problems, leverage cognitive diversity. We want to mitigate, I hate to use the word biases and heuristics. I know we don't want to go down that path, but we're trying to leverage the cognitive diversity of the group the best we can. We also want to see from their perspective on why we're going to fail potentially or why this project may fail. Can you just comment on your pre-mortem technique in injecting it inside of a TDG or experiential learning activity?
Sure. So I developed the pre-mortem technique over 30 years ago. But I never developed it as a technique. It was just something that we did inside my company.
Mm-hmm.
And most of our projects went well, but occasionally one of them would not, and we would do a post-mortem to see where did we go wrong. And I thought, we're learning from it. Too bad we didn't have this at the very beginning of the project. And then I wondered, why don't we do it at the beginning of the project? So now we do it at the beginning of projects as we're getting started. Now, many times when there's a kickoff meeting or preparation for a new project, people will do a critique. They'll say, here's the plan. Does anybody see any problems? And they'll think that that covers them. That gives them gives everybody the opportunity to speak out. But the brutal fact is hardly anybody raises any problems for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of enthusiasm for the plan, so you don't want to spoil that kind of harmony. Another is you're not thinking about what can go wrong. You're ready to get started, and this is slowing you down. And so there's just for a variety of social harmony issues and focus issues, people don't give you the answers that they need. So the pre-mortem technique is a way of changing people's mindsets. And the way it works is we say, here's the plan. We've all been briefed on the plan. Now, if I'm leading the session, I'll say, I'm looking in a crystal ball and oh no, the crystal ball shows clearly this plan has failed. It's fallen apart. It's now 6 months later, maybe a year later, whatever's the right time frame, and this plan has been a fiasco. And when we look past each other in the hall, we avoid eye contact because it's just been such a painful disaster. So we know the plan has failed, right? Everybody around the table, take 2 minutes, each of you individually, 2 minutes, and write down all the reasons why this plan has failed. You know it's failed. We don't know why. You're going to write down all the reasons you can think of. And people start writing like crazy. I only give them 2 minutes because I want to keep the energy level up. And then when 2 minutes is up, I say, okay, pen's up, time to see what we've learned. And I go around the room. What's the top of your list? And I'll write it on a whiteboard. What's the top of your list that hasn't been covered? And we'll write that, and we'll just compile what the people in the group have come up with. And it's amazing the kinds of things that people will articulate that they would never say if you just asked them, anybody see any problems? Nobody would, because the pressure, because you've just been working together to build this plan. So there's a pressure to encourage the belief that the plan is going to work. And you don't want any naysayers. With the pre-mortem, the way you show you're smart is by coming up with really insightful reasons why this plan failed. Now, once we'd always done it inside the company, but once we had a big project, an Air Force project, and I said, let's do it with a larger team. We had our Air Force sponsor, we had other contractors, and we had like a 3-day kickoff meeting. And I said, let's do a pre-mortem at the end because I think it'll help. And my Air Force sponsor, who's a lieutenant colonel, said, absolutely no way. I described how the method worked, and he said, that is such a downer. That is that's going to drain all the enthusiasm. No way. And I said, trust me on this. And reluctantly, we went ahead and did the pre-mortem. And we're going around the room. We were building a system that was going to be for targeting, and it was going to be put out in the field. This was right after Desert Storm, and it was going to be fielded. And we thought we had the technology needed. We just had to port it over into the computers they had in the field. And we come to this young captain. He hadn't said a word for 3 days. But it was his turn. And he looked and he said, top of my list is the kind of algorithm you're talking about runs on a supercomputer, and it takes about 48 hours to get an answer. They don't have that kind of equipment in the field. They have a very limited laptop. They don't. The technique you're talking about isn't going to work. And there was quiet in the room as everybody realized he was exactly right. And somebody else piped up and said, I have a back of the envelope technique that I use as a shortcut that generally gets me pretty close. And we said, okay, maybe we're not dead yet. And it became a very effective project that was still going on 10 years after we finished. That's how a pre-mortem works. It gets people to voice their genuine concerns. It's not like an exercise where somebody is told, your job is to come up with criticisms and nobody knows if they're legitimate or not. These are genuine concerns people would have. That's how it works.
Yeah. So there's an aspect of this that I love, and that's using the pre-mortem to break the artificial harmony that's in an organization or a team and to increase those insights, right? And that's why we use it quite effectively. But like you pointed out, not all leaders and team members want to do it because it's they didn't grow up with this. It's not familiar to them. But there's another aspect of this type of thinking, and that when it comes to improving performance, I believe it helps reduce errors, right? And you write about that years ago, and even in your new book, improving performance depends on reducing errors, but it also depends on increasing insights. That's what we're trying to do with the pre-mortem is increase insights. Can the same be true about decreasing errors through a pre-mortem?
Right. So one of the issues that I have is about how to improve performance. And there's two things that one way of looking at it is there's two things you want to do. There's something you want to reduce. You want to reduce errors. You want to reduce mistakes. There's another thing you want to do. You want to increase insights and expertise because you don't want to just reduce mistakes. You don't want to go home at the end of the day and say, I had a great day. I didn't make any mistakes. Well, if that's your goal, why did you even go to work? You want to accomplish things. But most organizations only know about the reducing errors. They have all kinds of techniques for reducing errors. Mm-hmm. They don't have any, hardly any, do any work on increasing insights. And I know this was true in some work we did with the intelligence community. A pre-mortem, I think, can do both. A pre-mortem is helping people flag potential mistakes before you make it. Because at the end of a pre-mortem, we look at the list of possible problems that might have arisen, and we say, how can we avoid or prevent some of these? What changes can we make in the plan? What changes can each of us make? So I think it's a way of cutting down the number of mistakes that you make by improving the plan. It also increases the chance for insights because I may write down my problems with the pre-mortem, and I think it's going to be obvious to everybody. But as we go around the room, I'm hearing things from my colleagues that I had never even considered.
Mm-hmm.
So we're learning from each other. There's a collective wisdom that's being grown in the team, and we're also increasing the sophistication of our mental model as we listen to the sorts of things that people have identified. And it changes the culture of the team.
Right.
Because now people have gone through this exercise where they have surfaced their doubts in public, which
Right.
is very difficult in most teams. So there's now a different culture of candor than existed before.
No, it's absolutely fantastic as a coach to see teams adopt this and take it on as their own, and really, the more coaching capability we develop in an organization, we see that in return when we see the work that, like a pre-mortem being shared with us down the road somewhere else. So we do know that it's being picked up quite a bit within the organizations that we coach. I want to shift over to your new book, Snapshots of the Mind. And there's something in there that my kids just absolutely loved, and that was the Tower of Hanoi, the classic puzzle there. To be honest, I probably enjoyed it more than they did, but it was super fun. Yeah, you walk us through that?
Sure. So I wrote this book as a collection of essays that I've been preparing on a blog that I have, essays going back almost a decade. And I have many essays, and I picked the ones that I thought would be the most exciting for readers. And then I collected them, and then I wrote an introduction to the book. And then for each of the sections, I wrote an introduction and reflections at the end of the section. So basically, the book is my attempt to get people to adopt a sensitivity to the cognitive dimension, so that they get out of a procedural mindset to a more sophisticated mindset about the expertise, the tacit knowledge that often goes unnoticed, especially from the experts themselves. There's 9 different sections. They involve training, and they involve techniques for collecting information, for building insights, things like that. Now, the Tower of Hanoi essay, which was fun to write. The Tower of Hanoi, I don't know if the people tuning into this podcast are familiar with it. If they're not, so much the better. Mm-hmm. Then you need to buy my new book and turn to that chapter. But it's a simple problem. It's been around for about a century. You've got 3 rods, and you have a number of discs that fit over one of them in descending order of size, and you've got to move them from the first rod to the third one. And the only rule is you can't have a larger one go over a smaller one. So it's a kind of a complex task, and as as you have greater number of discs, the harder it gets. This has been around for a century. Mm-hmm. Psychologists have studied it for at least a half a century. So this is exactly the kind of toy problem I never wanted to study in my whole career. I want to study people like you, mm-hmm. Ponch. I want to study firefighters. I want to study emergency department physicians. Those are the people that I'm excited about, not about toy laboratory problems. But nevertheless, we did a study. We did it, I'm ashamed to tell you, because of greed. We had a project, and we were a subcontractor, and there was money left over, and we hadn't. We had finished our tasks, and they still were supposed to give us some money, about $25,000, and they said, and the contract monitor said, okay, what I'd like you to do is cognitive interviews around the Tower of Hanoi problem. And I thought, there's no way in the world I want to do that. But I also didn't want to wave goodbye to $25,000. So we had just made a new hire, a very sweet guy, Andy Mills. And I said, Andy, you're going to do this project. You're going to do those interviews. This is how you're going to learn to do cognitive interviews. And I had tried to foist this project on all kinds of people in my company. They all turned it down. But Andy was so new, he didn't know that history. So he came out of my office feeling great. He thought, wow, I'm going to get to do this project. And he told a couple of our colleagues about it, and they shook their head and said, so Gary found his pigeon. He found this poor sucker who's going to do it.
Yeah.
And there's only one way to do a Tower of Hanoi problem, and you're not going to learn anything. Well, he interviewed 7 people. No 2 people did it the same way. And we wound up learning things about the Tower of Hanoi problem that no one had ever come up with before. And we were able to make discoveries even with something as simple as this laboratory project. That demonstrates the power of cognitive interviews, that you're able to make these discoveries that on domains that people thought were solved a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, there's many reasons to buy your book, including that, your new book. You do talk about heuristics and biases, which we'll leave for the readers to go out or listeners to go out and read that in the book. You talk about fixation errors, confirmation bias a little bit. Maybe we can hit on that. But one thing that's missing, I didn't see it, was Six Sigma.
So I have enough enemies in the world that I don't need to make new ones all the time. I'm not a fan of Six Sigma. What don't I like about Six Sigma? I have this diagram about improving performance, and there's a down arrow, what you want to reduce, which is errors. I mentioned that just a few minutes ago. And the up arrow, which is increasing insights and increasing expertise. And Six Sigma is all about the down arrow. And it turns a creative, vital organization into one that's obsessed with avoiding errors and doesn't really care about what the consequences are, even if it squelches insights and discoveries and new products. I once had the chief innovation officer of a company tell me that his company had bought in on Six Sigma and techniques like that. And they had been very innovative at the beginning. That's how they got to be so successful. But since they've adopted that technique, in the decade or two since, they've had like 50 proposals come up about new kinds of ventures they could engage in. And they turned down every single one. They had changed from a creative company into one that was frightened of any possibility of making a mistake.
Yep, and we see Lean Six Sigma in a lot of organizations, and we do know it has bounded applicability. And using Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework more on the ordered side or clear domain. So there's that aspect of it. I want to kind of wrap it up. I know we're coming close to our time together today, but anything else you want to cover? Anything you want to ask about? Anything around our ecosystem, your ecosystem? Want to make more enemies? Anything like that?
No, I don't need more enemies, but I do. The reason I wrote the book and I do podcasts like this is I am trying to get people sensitized to the cognitive dimension and to recognize it when they encounter it in their everyday life, and to appreciate the expertise around them, to appreciate the insights that they come up with. Often we don't realize the insights that we have. When we make a mistake, we kick ourselves. Why was I so stupid? But when we have an insight, we usually fail to appreciate it and savor it. I also want to invite listeners and viewers to plug into the Naturalistic Decision Making Association, which was stood up about a year ago, and it puts on webinars. We put on another conference on naturalistic decision making back in October. John Schmidt ran that, and that's, I think, the 16th that we've had since 1989. So we put them on every 2 or 3 years. And so anybody who wants to get more attuned to the cognitive dimension. Those are some of the things you can take, or you can follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter.
Fantastic. I do have one last question. Michael Lewis, has he commented on anything about your new book?
If he has, I haven't seen it. I did a podcast with Michael Lewis a few years ago,
Okay.
and I've met him. We had lunch together a few times, but I haven't seen any comments on my new book. But that's a good idea. Maybe I should reach out to him.
That's another reason why our listeners need to go read your book to understand the context of that question, right? So,
Yes,
Gary Klein, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. It's been just a fantastic conversation. I wish we could have 4 more hours of your time and then another week after that. But I do know that we're coming up on our time today. Thank you very much for being on No Way Out, and we'll connect with you soon.
I hope so. Take care, Ponch.
All right.